Keanu Reeves stepped into the biting cold of a December evening in Manhattan, his breath misting in the air as he moved through the bustling streets. The city lights flickered against the polished windows of Les LV, one of New York's most exclusive French restaurants. Inside, conversations were hushed, the clinking of fine crystal echoing through the opulent dining hall. The restaurant exuded luxury in every corner, so much so that only those who looked the part were made to feel welcome. Inside, the warm glow of chandeliers reflected off neatly arranged silverware and pristine white tablecloths. Conversations were hushed, with whispers of business deals and expensive vacations filling the air. The restaurant exuded luxury in every corner, so much so that only those who looked the part were made to feel welcome. Unfortunately, Patricia Taylor did not. Dressed in a simple wool coat, a knitted scarf wrapped securely around her neck, and modest black slacks, she entered Les LV with hopeful curiosity. She wasn't one for extravagance, but her son, Keanu Reeves, had insisted she treat herself while visiting New York. He was away at an event that evening, but before leaving, he had reminded her, "Mom, you deserve the best. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But the moment she stepped inside, Patricia felt the weight of 100 scrutinizing gazes. Then came the voice. "How dare you even come in here dressed like that?" The words were sharp, dripping with condescension, and they cut through the ambient chatter like a knife. Patricia stopped in her tracks. A waiter, tall and slim, with slick-back blonde hair, had approached her, his thin lips curling into an amused smirk. His name tag read Greg, and everything about his demeanor screamed arrogance. "Ma'am," he continued, deliberately loud enough for nearby diners to hear, "this restaurant has a very strict dress code. We don't accommodate casual diners." Patricia's breath caught in her throat. She had never been spoken to like this before, not even in Hollywood's most elite circles. Still, she managed a polite smile. "I understand. I was hoping to find a table, but if it's an issue—" "It is an issue," Greg interrupted, eyeing her coat like it was something offensive. "There are plenty of diners down the street that would be more suitable for you." The humiliation crept up her spine, warming her cheeks. She glanced around, noticing a few amused patrons exchanging glances. Whispers floated through the air. Who does she think she is? Probably lost. Maybe she's looking for a free meal. Patricia swallowed hard. If she had been younger, if this had happened decades ago, when she was a struggling single mother, she might have turned around and left. But age had gifted her a quiet strength, and tonight, she reminded herself of Keanu's words. "Mom, you belong anywhere you want to be." Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders. "I'll wait for a table, thank you." Greg's smirk deepened. "Suit yourself." He turned to a younger waiter standing nearby. "Andrew, see if we have a table for our guest." There was something in his tone that made Patricia's stomach twist, a mockery, like she was some charity case he was being forced to accommodate. As Andrew rushed off, Patricia overheard Greg whisper to a nearby server, "Watch, she'll be gone in 5 minutes." The other server chuckled in agreement. She gripped her purse a little tighter, every muscle in her body screaming at her to leave. But then, the front door opened, and everything changed. A man stepped in from the cold, his tall frame wrapped in a black leather jacket, dark jeans, and worn boots. His long hair was tucked beneath a beanie, his jawline sharp, his movements effortless. He exuded quiet confidence, and yet, he did not draw immediate attention. Except from one person. The moment Patricia saw him, her heart clenched. "Mom." Keanu Reeves' voice was unmistakable, rich with warmth, yet laced with quiet intensity. His brown eyes scanned her face, taking in the way she held herself. Rigid, unsure, hurt. Patricia blinked, suddenly at a loss for words. "Keanu?" The restaurant fell into a hush as recognition rippled across the room. Murmurs started up. "Is that? No way, that's Keanu Reeves." "What's he doing here?" Greg's smirk vanished, his entire body stiffened as his face drained of color. Keanu, however, paid no attention to the growing stares. He walked up to his mother, gently placing a protective arm around her shoulders. "Is this man bothering you?" Patricia hesitated, not wanting to make a scene. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I think maybe I don't belong here after all. Keanu's jaw tightened. He belongs wherever she wants to be. His words weren't loud, but they carried a force that made Greg visibly swallow. The waiter opened his mouth, scrambling for an excuse. I didn't realize who she was. If I had known she was with someone important, Keanu turned toward him sharply. Important? He took a deliberate step forward, his gaze unwavering. She's important because she's a person. That should have been enough. Silence. Greg looked utterly mortified. Patricia placed a hand on Keanu's arm. Keanu, it's okay. Let's just go somewhere else. But Keanu wasn't finished. He turned to Andrew, the young waiter who had stepped in earlier. Were you the one who tried to seat her? Andrew nodded hesitantly. Yes, sir. Keanu reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick stack of bills. He handed them to Andrew without hesitation. This is for being the only decent person here tonight. Andrew's hands trembled as he accepted the money, his face a mixture of shock and gratitude. Greg, on the other hand, looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Wait, please, let me make it up to you. Keanu didn't even glance his way. You don't need to make it up to us, he said, his voice even but firm. You need to think about why you treated her that way in the first place. With that, Keanu turned, guiding his mother out of the restaurant. As they stepped into the cold night, Patricia let out a slow breath, still reeling from what had just happened. Keanu, you didn't have to do all that. Keanu turned to her, his expression softening. Mom, you taught me to treat people with kindness, but that doesn't mean I have to stand by when someone disrespects you. Patricia swallowed the lump in her throat. There was so much she wanted to say about the past, about the struggles, about how much it still hurt when people like Greg looked down on her, but instead, she simply leaned into her son, letting the warmth of his presence chase away the cold of the night. Do you remember that little diner we used to go to in Toronto? She asked suddenly. The one with the pancakes? Keanu's lips curved into a smile. Yeah, best syrup I've ever had. Patricia squeezed his arm. Let's find somewhere like that. Without hesitation, Keanu nodded. Somewhere simple, somewhere real. And as they disappeared into the city, the weight of the night began to fade, replaced by something stronger, something unbreakable. A mother's love and a son's unwavering devotion. Keanu and Patricia walked side by side, the cold air wrapping around them as the bright lights of the city shimmered in the distance. Patricia held onto her son's arm, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the layers she was wearing. Keanu, still visibly upset from what had happened at the restaurant, remained quiet for a few moments. Patricia could feel the tension in his body, the way his jaw clenched slightly as if he were replaying the scene over and over in his head. Keanu, she said gently, tugging on his sleeve, let it go. I don't want to spend our evening thinking about that man. Keanu let out a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. I know, Mom, but it's just... He stopped, searching for the right words. It bothers me that people still treat others like that they think kindness is based on status. Patricia smiled softly, patting his hand. Some people will always judge based on what they see, but I learned long ago that their judgment is their burden, not mine. Keanu turned to look at her, his expression softening. He admired his mother's strength more than anything. No matter how many struggles she had faced, she never let bitterness take hold of her. You're stronger than I'll ever be, he admitted. Patricia chuckled. Oh, sweetheart, don't say that. I just learned to pick my battles. As they continued walking, the neon glow of a small 24-hour diner came into view. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm buttered toast drifted onto the street, inviting them inside. It wasn't glamorous, but it was exactly what they needed. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, save for a couple of night shift workers nursing cups of coffee and an elderly man reading a newspaper at the counter. A tired-looking waitress with kind eyes greeted them with a smile. Take any booth you like, sweetheart, she said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had been on her feet all day. They slid into a booth by the window, the vinyl seats creaking slightly beneath them. The warmth of the diner immediately melted away the night's bitter cold. Now this is more like it, Patricia said, glancing around. No dress codes, no judgments, just good food and good company. Keanu grinned, pulling off his beanie and shaking his hair loose. Best part? I don't have to pretend to be fancy. The waitress returned, setting down 2 glasses of water and a couple of menus. She gave Keanu a second glance, her brow furrowing in recognition. You look familiar, she said thoughtfully. Keanu smiled. I get that a lot. The woman studied him for another second before shrugging. Well, whoever you are, welcome. What can I get you folks? Patricia flipped open the menu, her eyes lighting up. Ooh, they have pancakes. It's meant to be. Keanu chuckled. 2 stacks then? And extra syrup, Patricia added. The waitress scribbled down the order, shaking her head with amusement. 2 stacks of pancakes, extra syrup, and coffee? Keanu nodded. And a grilled cheese for me. Coming right up. As the waitress walked away, Patricia rested her chin on her hand, studying her son. You know, Keanu, I never really get to do this. Do what? Just sit and talk with you without the cameras, the press, the people constantly trying to pull you in a dozen directions. Keanu's smile softened. I know, Mom, and I hate that. That's why nights like this matter to me. Patricia sighed, stirring her water absent-mindedly. You've always been a good son, Keanu, but sometimes I wonder if the world lets you be just a person. Not an actor, not a celebrity, just you. Keanu leaned back against the booth, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. Sometimes it does, but most of the time it doesn't. He hesitated before continuing. It's why I like moments like this. No expectations, no performances, just us. Patricia smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. That's all I ever wanted for you, to have a place where you could just be yourself. Keanu looked down at their joined hands and then back up at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he sighed. You know, when I was a kid, I used to think you were invincible. Patricia laughed. Oh, sweetheart, I was barely keeping it together half the time. I didn't see that. I just saw a mom who worked harder than anyone I'd ever met. A mom who made everything feel safe, even when things weren't. Patricia's smile faltered slightly, emotion swelling in her chest. You were my world, Keanu. You and your siblings. I didn't have a choice but to be strong. Keanu leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. You always had a choice, and you chose to keep going, to fight, to give us a better life. Patricia shook her head, blinking back tears. And look at you now. You turned out to be the most kind-hearted man I know. Before Keanu could respond, the waitress returned with their food, setting down the plates with a knowing smile. There you go, darlings. Hope it's as good as you remember. Patricia laughed, wiping her eyes discreetly. Thank you, sweetheart. As they dug into their food, the tension of the night slowly melted away. They talked about old memories, snowy mornings in Toronto, nights when Patricia would sew costumes for Keanu's school plays, the time they made an entire Thanksgiving dinner out of canned goods because money was tight. Each story brought them closer, reminding them of where they had come from and how far they had traveled together. When they finally finished their meal, Keanu leaned back with a content sigh. That was perfect. Patricia dabbed at her lips with a napkin. Exactly what we needed. As Keanu pulled out his wallet to pay, the waitress waved him off. Don't worry about it, it's on the house. Keanu frowned. You don't have to do that. The woman smiled knowingly. I don't have to, but I want to. Besides, I think the world could use a little more kindness tonight, don't you? Keanu hesitated before nodding. Yeah, it definitely could. Patricia reached out and patted the waitress's hand. Thank you, dear. That means more than you know. As they stepped out of the diner, the night air no longer felt as harsh. The city stretched before them, alive and endless. Patricia took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp air. Where to now? Keanu asked. Patricia thought for a moment before smiling. Let's just walk for a bit. I want to take in the city. Keanu nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets as they strolled down the quiet street. Tonight hadn't gone as planned, but in a way, it had been exactly what they needed. For Patricia, it was a reminder that kindness still existed, even in the most unexpected places. For Keanu, it was a chance to give back, even in the smallest ways. And for both of them, it was a night they would never forget. As they disappeared into the city lights, one thing was certain: love, respect, and family would always matter more than anything else. The streets of New York stretched endlessly before them, illuminated by streetlights casting long golden beams onto the damp pavement. The night had taken a turn. What had started with humiliation had transformed into something deeper, something that reminded them both of what truly mattered. Keanu walked beside his mother, their footsteps steady and unhurried. Patricia glanced up at her son, watching the way his breath misted in the cold air. He had always been like this, silent in his strength, never making a show of his emotions but feeling everything deeply. She knew tonight had unsettled him, not just because of the way she had been treated, but because it reminded him of old wounds, of struggles they had endured together long before he became a household name. "You used to hate this city," Patricia murmured, pulling her coat tighter around herself. Keanu looked over, surprised by the statement. "I didn't know that." She smiled slightly. "It wasn't always kind to me. Back when I was younger, when I was trying to make something of myself, New York had a way of reminding me that I wasn't important enough. Too many closed doors, too many people looking at me the way that waiter did tonight." Keanu's expression darkened. "I wish I could have been there then." Patricia chuckled, shaking her head. "Sweetheart, you were just a kid. And besides, those moments, they made me stronger. Just like tonight reminded me of something important." "What's that?" "That no matter how much the world changes, there will always be people who look down on others. But there will also always be people who lift others up." She reached over and patted his arm. "Like you." Keanu exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening slightly. "You shouldn't have to put up with that. No one should." "That's true, but we don't change people like that by getting angry. We change them by showing them what kindness looks like, and you did that tonight." He shook his head slightly. "I don't know if that guy will ever change." "Maybe not, but Andrew saw, the other staff saw, even the customers saw. Sometimes that's enough to plant a seed." They turned a corner, stepping into a quieter street lined with bookstores and small shops that had long since closed for the night. Patricia slowed her pace, peering into one of the windows where a display of old paperbacks stood proudly behind a glass pane. "I used to dream of owning a bookstore," she said absently. Keanu raised a brow. "Really?" She nodded. "I never told you that, did I? When I was younger, I imagined running a tiny little shop, one of those cozy places with mismatched chairs and a cat lounging in the window." Keanu smiled. "That actually sounds perfect." She sighed, a wistful expression crossing her face. "Life had other plans. You could still do it." She laughed softly. "At my age? Why not?" He leaned against the window frame. "You always told me that it's never too late to chase a dream." Patricia studied her son, her heart swelling with pride. He had always listened to her, more than she sometimes realized, and now, here he was, reminding her of the very lessons she had taught him. "Maybe one day," she said, smiling. They continued walking, letting the city guide them. The streets were calmer now, the rush of the evening crowd fading into the hush of midnight. Keanu suddenly stopped in front of a small, family-owned cafe that was still open. A sign in the window read, "Live Jazz Tonight." Through the glass, they could see a trio playing softly on a tiny stage, their music filling the space with a gentle rhythm. "Let's go in," Keanu suggested. Patricia hesitated. "Are you sure? You're usually careful about places like this." "I don't think anyone's expecting me here," he grinned. "Besides, I think we deserve one more good memory tonight." They stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe immediately wrapping around them like a familiar embrace. A few patrons sat at tables sipping coffee and swaying slightly to the music. The woman at the counter looked up, her eyes widening in recognition before softening with understanding. She didn't say a word, only gestured for them to sit wherever they liked. Patricia and Keanu slid into a booth near the back, where the music was clear but the lighting was dim enough to keep them from standing out too much. A waitress approached, an older woman with silver hair tucked into a bun. "What can I get you two?" she asked kindly. Keanu glanced at his mother. "Tea?" Patricia nodded. That sounds lovely. The woman jotted down their order and disappeared behind the counter. Keanu leaned back against the cushioned seat, his eyes drifting toward the stage. This reminds me of those nights when I was little, he mused. You'd put on a record after dinner and we'd just sit and listen. Patricia chuckled. You had an ear for music even then. I'd find you humming along to melodies you'd only heard once. Keanu smirked. I was preparing for all the guitar playing I'd end up doing. Their tea arrived, steam curling from the cups as the soft strum of a double bass filled the air. Patricia wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the moment settle around her. I wouldn't trade any of it, she said suddenly. Keanu looked at her. Any of what? The struggles, the hard years, even tonight, she met his gaze. Because, in the end, it led us here. Keanu's throat tightened. He had spent much of his life carrying the weight of his past, of losses that never truly faded, but sitting here, across from the woman who had given him everything, he realized something. He had never been alone in that journey. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the music, sipping their tea, and letting the night wind down in the quiet way only jazz and warm conversation could provide. Eventually, Patricia exhaled softly. We should head back soon. Keanu nodded. I'll call a car. As they left the cafe, stepping into the stillness of the night, Patricia took one last look at the city. For the first time in years, she didn't feel unwelcome here. She felt at home. And as Keanu gently wrapped his arm around her shoulders, guiding her toward their ride, she knew one thing for certain. No matter where they were in the world, as long as they had each other, they would always belong. As they stepped out into the quiet night, Patricia breathed in the crisp air, feeling the weight of the evening settling in her bones. The warmth of the cafe still clung to her, but the exhaustion from the night's events was beginning to creep in. Keanu noticed the slight droop in her posture and immediately slowed his pace. You all right, Mom? He asked, glancing down at her. Patricia smiled up at him, patting his arm. Just a little tired. I think my excitement quota has been filled for the night. Keanu chuckled. That's fair. Let's get you back to the hotel. But instead of calling a car immediately, they kept walking, their footsteps in sync as they strolled through the nearly empty streets. Patricia wasn't in a hurry to go back, and neither was Keanu. There was something about the city at this hour. The way the streetlights cast soft glows against the pavement, the distant hum of traffic, the rare peace that settled over New York when the night stretched past midnight. As they walked past a small bookstore, Keanu paused. The window display showcased a variety of old novels, their worn spines stacked haphazardly, giving the store a cozy, lived-in charm. A closed sign hung on the door, but the light inside was still on. Patricia followed his gaze and smiled. Now, this is my kind of place. Keanu studied the store for a moment before glancing down at his mother. You know, I could make that dream of yours happen. Patricia blinked in confusion. What dream? The bookstore, Keanu said. You always wanted one, right? She laughed softly, shaking her head. That was a long time ago, sweetheart. He shrugged. You still love books. You still love the idea. It's not too late. Patricia gave him a knowing look. Keanu, I appreciate the thought, but I don't need some grand gesture. I'm happy with my life. He smiled. I know, but you've spent your whole life making sure everyone else had what they needed. Maybe it's time for you to have something just for yourself. She softened, touched by his sincerity. You're too good to me. Keanu smirked. That's debatable. Patricia laughed, squeezing his arm. You really are your father's son, you know. Keanu's smile faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. I'd like to think I'm your son. She sighed, sensing the emotion in his voice. You are, and that's something I'm proud of every single day. They continued walking, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. When they finally reached Patricia's hotel, Keanu walked her inside, making sure she got to her room safely. As they stood at the door, Patricia turned to him, studying his face. You're staying nearby, right? She asked. Keanu nodded. Yeah, just a few blocks away. Patricia hesitated before speaking. Then why don't you stay here tonight? It's been a while since we just sat and talked for no reason. Keanu smiled. Are you trying to keep an eye on me? Always, she said without hesitation. With a small laugh, he agreed. All right, Mom, I'll stay. They entered the hotel room and Patricia immediately kicked off her shoes with a sigh of relief. Keanu walked over to the small kitchenette, grabbed 2 bottles of water from the fridge, and handed one to her. Patricia settled into the plush armchair near the window, sighing contentedly. This is nice. Keanu sat on the couch, stretching out his legs. Yeah, it is. For a while, they just sat there, enjoying the quiet. Patricia glanced over at him, noticing the way he rubbed the back of his neck, something he did when he was deep in thought. What's on your mind? She asked. Keanu hesitated for a moment before answering. Tonight just made me think about a lot of things. Like what? Like how much I hate the way some people treat others, like how I wish I could fix it, but I know I can't. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. And how much I miss the way things used to be when life was simpler. Patricia's heart ached at his words. She knew exactly what he meant. You carry too much, sweetheart, she said gently. Keanu shook his head. I want to make sure the people I care about are okay. And that's a beautiful thing, Patricia said. But you can't save the world, Keanu. I know. He exhaled slowly. But I can try. Patricia reached over and placed her hand on his. You already do more than enough. And you need to remember to take care of yourself, too. Keanu looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he smiled. I learned from the best. Patricia rolled her eyes affectionately. Flattery won't get you out of an early morning tomorrow. Keanu groaned dramatically. I knew there was a catch. Patricia chuckled, leaning back in her chair. I just want breakfast with my son. Is that too much to ask? Keanu grinned. Not at all. But can we at least find a place that doesn't have a dress code? Patricia laughed. Deal. They sat in silence for a little while longer, the city lights twinkling outside the window. Patricia glanced over at her son, watching as he absent-mindedly traced patterns on the arm of the couch. You know, she said softly, you don't always have to be strong. Keanu looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. What do you mean? I mean, you don't always have to carry everything on your own. You can lean on people too. Keanu studied her for a moment before nodding. I know, it's just hard. Patricia gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. I understand, but you don't have to do it alone. He smiled, grateful for her words, even if he wasn't sure he knew how to follow them. After a while, Patricia stood up and stretched. All right, I think it's time for this old lady to get some sleep. Keanu chuckled. You're not old, Mom. She raised an eyebrow. Tell that to my knees. He laughed, standing up as well. All right, I'll let you get some rest. Patricia hugged him tightly, holding on to him a little longer than usual. I love you, Keanu. Keanu held her just as tightly. I love you too, Mom. As he pulled away, she patted his cheek. Try to get some sleep too, all right? He nodded. She gave him one last smile before heading to bed, and Keanu settled onto the couch, staring out the window as the city buzzed quietly outside. Despite everything that had happened that night, despite the ugliness they had encountered, it had ended in the best way possible. With love, with understanding, with family. And as he finally closed his eyes, Keanu knew that no matter what, he would always have that. Keanu sat on the couch, the soft hum of the city outside his window blending with the steady rhythm of his own breath. The night had been long, filled with unexpected turns, but as he sat there in the quiet of his mother's hotel room, he felt something rare, peace. His gaze drifted to the small clock on the nightstand. It was past 2 a.m., but sleep didn't feel urgent. Instead, he let himself sink into the rare stillness. The kind of stillness that didn't exist in his everyday life. No cameras, no interviews, no strangers asking for autographs, just him, his mother sleeping in the next room, and the city that had both challenged and embraced them tonight. He pulled out his phone and hesitated before sending a message to his assistant, asking them to find a few independent bookstores for sale in Los Angeles. Maybe Patricia had dismissed the idea earlier, But he knew her well enough to know that dreams never really faded. They just waited for the right moment to be revisited. After sending the message, he glanced toward the window, his mind wandering. The incident at the restaurant still lingered, not in the way that made him angry, but in the way that made him think. How many people went through moments like that every day? People who didn't have someone to stand up for them, who had to endure that kind of treatment in silence. He exhaled slowly. The world wasn't fair, but that didn't mean people couldn't make it better, even in small ways. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound. He turned his head and saw Patricia standing in the doorway, her robe wrapped around her as she rubbed sleep from her eyes. "I couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice still heavy with drowsiness. Keanu smiled. "I was just thinking." Patricia walked over and sat beside him, sighing as she leaned back against the couch. "Too many thoughts at this hour," she murmured. "Dangerous." He chuckled. "Maybe." She studied him for a moment. "You're thinking about tonight, aren't you?" Keanu hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. But not just that. About everything. About how much things have changed and how much some things never do." Patricia placed a gentle hand over his. "You can't carry the world on your shoulders, sweetheart." "Oh, I know." He sighed. "But if I can make even a small difference, I want to." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "And you already do more than you know." Keanu looked at her, a warmth settling in his chest. "You know, I was actually looking up bookstores earlier." Patricia raised a brow. "Oh. Just options," he said casually. "No pressure." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You never give up, do you?" He grinned. "Not when it comes to you." Patricia rested her head against his shoulder. "Well, if you find one with a cozy reading nook and a good tea selection, maybe." Keanu smiled. "Consider it done." And with that, they sat there in the quiet, the city stretching endlessly before them, knowing that no matter what, they would always have each other. Want more? Check out the video on screen for another amazing story and hit subscribe to stay updated with our newest content.